I will have a presentation with maybe a bit more historical perspective than what is usual, because I would like to speak about how political ideology and spatial planning were intertwined with regard to rural schools in Hungary. And I wouldn't like to focus on contemporary things, but on the interwar period and on the communist period. Well, so this will be the structure. The three phases I will be speaking about, as you can see, the communist period will be divided in two for good reasons. I will explain why. My aim is not only to speak about ruptures. Of course, there have been many ruptures in Hungarian history, but you will see that there were continuities as well, even with regard to rural schools. So let's begin the story with the early 20th century. Inequalities in education exist everywhere and in every context. However, it is quite interesting which aspects of these disparities are problematized and taken into consideration and which ones not. Speaking about Hungary in the early 20th century, it was the ethnic aspect that was problematized, or at least it was taken into consideration. You see here some statistics from 1910 on literacy rates for different ethnic groups living in then Hungary. And you see that, well, except for Germans, who had, of course, better values than the Hungarians did, all those other minorities had a bit lower values. And there was a very simple narrative for this. The claim was that this shows, well, that the Hungarians had a sort of cultural advantage, which was a narrative in order, to justify geopolitical aims, actually. On the one hand, Hungary was somehow presented as a project to civilize the nationalities. The concept was that these nationalities have a better chance to get higher culture or more culture if they belong to Hungary. And it was also underscored that although some nationalities had really low values compared to other ones, such as the Romanians, still their values, but still their values were better than those Romanians living in then Romania outside of Hungary. And well, this narrative was used and applied quite broadly, even during the First World War, and even after the First World War during the peace negotiations. For geography of education, or geography of literacy, it was basically presented as the geography of the ethnics. You see here two maps for 1910, male and female illiteracy rates. And basically in those regions where the Hungarian population formed the majority, these values were higher, and in other regions they were lower. Of course, the background was much more complex, but it could be presented in a very simple way. However, the final outcome of the peace negotiations was still that Hungary was somehow divided up, so roughly 2/3 of the territory of the country surrendered to other countries. This shows well that this narrative of cultural advantage was somehow not really taken by those who made the decisions. And you can see here that the first reaction from the Hungarian political elite was to speak about this so-called Trianon trauma. The peace treaty took place in Trianon, and it actually traumatized Hungarian society for the huge territorial losses. So the interpretation was that this act is against European civilization now, because it will somehow hinder that these minorities, which now have their sovereign countries, can get higher culture. You see here a quote from Count Albert Apponyi, who was head of the Hungarian delegation to the peace conference. Very diplomatic, but you get the point. I believe that from the point of view of the great interests of humankind, one can observe neither indifferently nor with satisfaction the national hegemony being vested in nations that, even if holding up the best hopes for the future, still stand at a low level of culture. Meaning that, wow, this will be quite a problem for everyone. However, quite soon, the political elite had to realize, of course, that, they really had to take a new approach to this issue because the general circumstances changed. And in the interwar period, which was dominated by a national conservative regime, the concept of cultural advantage was reinterpreted by some, not by all. Actually, some used it later on the same way, But you see here Count Kuno Klebelsberg, who became the Minister of Religion and Education between 1922 and 1931 for quite a long time. He also used this concept of cultural advantage, but in a different way. His point was that today it is mainly not the sword, but culture that can defend the Hungarian homeland and make it again. And his narrative was not that Hungarians were claimed to have more culture or more civilization, therefore they have the right to get all those territories back. But his point was that if Hungary wants to become, well, an influential actor in international politics and economy, then it should become more civilized, because it had quite a disadvantage compared to Western European countries, as you see here, some values. So this sort of the concept of cultural advantage was already different. And Klebelsberg's point was that Hungary's position in international politics, in diplomacy and in economy really needs that somehow cultural development is showed up. We consider now the Ministry of Education as Ministry of Defending the Homeland, as he put it quite simply. And we also have to see a political agenda in the background. Klebelsberg, just as many of his leading politicians among his contemporaries, were quite close to that sort of aristocratic conservative system that, well, that somehow followed some British models. There were elections in this period, but less than 30% of the Hungarian people had the right to vote because they needed to achieve a certain education standard and a certain property or income standard as well. And the point of Klebelsberg was that in the long run, it will be necessary to introduce political democracy, but, and here the argumentation again, first social evolution shall take place, because otherwise political democracy doesn't make sense. As he put it, universal secret suffrage operates with ballots. I would love to see how one can work with ballots with around 1 million illiterate voters. He said that, well, you know, you can give any sort of piece in hands of people and they cannot even read what is there. So political democracy will become a benefit for the peoples only if prepared by real cultural democracy. And his actual program was to provide a comprehensive development of the entire cultural system, beginning with small rural schools until universities, cultural institutions, and everything. Where one aim was to establish people's schools in order to provide a certain standard of basic education for everyone, and also to, well, somehow promote elite education, mainly for the national middle class, as it was put in that period. But of course, concepts are just concepts if there is no money behind. Actually, in this period, money was behind. This was the period of the Prime Minister István Betlen, who actually supported his concept. He was also a good friend of Klebelsberg. And he always somehow managed to get the funding for these issues, although there were protests even from some other parts of the government. You see here that the share of the Ministry of Religion and Education from the government budget went up from less than 5% to 9% and more than 10% quite soon. Actually, this ministry had the biggest budget in the Hungarian government. That is quite exceptional, I think, usually, for all those reasons I mentioned. And here we can come to we can turn to the question of rural schools. That is what I promised. Actually, after the new boundaries were set and new scales were taken into consideration and new maps were created, now it became clear that even in this so-called smaller or truncated Hungary, there were huge spatial disparities of education. You see here illiteracy rates, the darker values indicating the darker colors indicating lower values. Here, more than 40% was illiterate, speaking about 1920. Yes, sure. Sorry if I put it in a different way. So dark colors are yes, low values of literacy, and these ones are high values of literacy. So in some regions it was just 5 or 6%, in some regions it was about 40%. And those regions which were especially problematic usually were those ones where the settlement structure was dominated by scattered farms. I will speak about these scattered farms quite soon. And this, well, this background was indeed a problem, because compulsory elementary education had been there in Hungary since the 1860s. It had been free of charge since 1908, and still in 1920 more than 17% of school-age children didn't attend any formal school education because it was simply far away and so on. So they tried to do something with it. Here you see two pictures of scattered farms, or tonya, as we call them in Hungarian. An old picture and a newer one. And for this Klebersbergian concept of promoting culture, one cornerstone was to establish rural schools, tonya schools, scattered farm schools, in order to provide access to those people living there. And it was a huge program, so actually they built 5,000 new schoolrooms and flats in a period of 6 or 7 years. It has been the last large-scale program in Hungarian history, actually, that was really fulfilled. And 2/3 of these schools were built in the Great Plains region, in agricultural regions, mostly in rural areas with scattered farms. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that these schools were very similar to their counterparts in big urban centers. You see that although there were almost 7,000 elementary schools around 36 and 37, but less than 10% of them were undivided or fully divided in sense of having a teacher for every class. Almost half of these schools had one teacher for all 6 classes. And the curriculum was also different. You see here that teaching hours were much less for these not divided schools, because the point was, of course, not that you can produce the high elite in a few years from these people who hadn't had access to basic education before, but it was thought to be a step-by-step process. And actually it was efficient in sense that illiteracy rates were pushed down from some 15% to below 8%, and actually the gap between Hungary and Western European countries decreased in that period. However, we shouldn't think that we can put an equal sign between the Klebersbergian concept and all the ideas and concepts and interests in the interwar period. There were huge debates. For example, Klebersberg was the minister until 1931, and actually he died in 1932. Then he was followed by Bálint Hóman, who was his friend and his colleague, but still he had some different views about the concept. Actually, he kept this program of building people's schools. However, for other parts of the education process, he thought that Klebersberg plans were oversized, especially for high culture. And he thought that less emphasis should be put on universities to avoid the overproduction of the intelligentsia. These are quotes from himself. He wanted to steer the middle class increasingly towards industry and commerce instead of academy and culture. And actually the education administration was increasingly centralized in this period. But of course, we have to take into consideration the changing political context as well. So we are speaking about the period after the Nazi takeover in Germany, after an increasing German orientation in Hungary, and after an ongoing political radicalization, which provided the framework for this process. And actually, Klebersberg was criticized even in his lifetime by many, including many other ministers as well, for wasting so much money on such stupid things as rural schools. And, well, it is also it reflects something from the day that both Klebersberg and Hóman were criticized by different people, even from the intelligentsia, as Germane Blutsverwandten. So for German consanguinity, the point was that it is impossible that culture, which is the most important thing in the country, is put in hands of German people. It was actually quite misleading. So Klebersberg had some Tyrolean roots in the family. Hóman had some German roots. These families had been living for a long time in Hungary. They were born in Hungary and so on. But, well, we are speaking about the 1930s. And then, of course, the world came, and huge parts of the country remained devastated thereafter. You see here how Budapest looked like in 1945. And Hungary became part of the Soviet occupation zone from 44-45. But in the first 3 years, multi-party governments were organized. Which means that, well, so the communist dictatorship was organized only a bit later, a few years later. And these multi-party governments first tried to somehow reconstruct the education network, of course. They didn't have more resources to do something more, but they made quite important changes in the framework, in the conceptual framework, including many steps that had already been planned in the interwar period in the long run. For example, basic education had lasted for 6 years before. From now on, it lasted for 8 years. Even Klebelsberg wanted to introduce this new system, but it took roughly 15 years until it was actually introduced. And then, after the communist takeover in 1948, the Stalinist period also had to do something with these rural schools. But there was quite, there were quite different interests for and against this thing. So on the one hand, actually, even the Stalinist system or the Stalinist regime was interested in providing equal access to education everywhere, not only for propagandistic reasons, but also because they realized that having a sort of basic knowledge is somehow still important if people are expected to contribute in building communism. And they also realized that school education was the best or the most efficient form of social control, and school spaces were an optimal arena to create the socialist type of human, as they said. But there were conflicting considerations in the meantime. Cost efficiency on the one hand, first because communism created for itself the image of being a project using resources efficiently, while after the late 1980s and early 1990s, maybe we are smiling when we see this, but well, it was taken seriously that time. And it was again not only for propagandistic reasons, but we are speaking about the Cold War with the rivalry with the West, and they actually needed to use resources efficiently. And the other point was centralization or democratic centralism, again a Leninist term, as prerequisite for control, orderliness, and economies of scale. So it was not easy to decide actually, or it was not determined from the very beginning what would happen to rural schools. But the first process, and that was clear that it should be taken for this regime, was the nationalization of the school system. You see here maintainers of elementary schools in 1938 and 37, very diverse, however, almost 2/3 funded by different churches, and then many other actors. And after 1948, the situation was quite simple. I mean, well, everything belonged to the state now. And centralization took place in public administration as well. This is how the system was reorganized in 1950. There were different levels of the hierarchy, but basically every power was allocated to the state. It was in hands of very few people. As János Bér, a leading as expert of administration of the period, put it, I think it is, it really shows what it was about. Local councils, so these low-level units, are not the organs of local authorities, but local organs of the authority. And after this process, rural settlements as such became increasingly problematized. So not only rural schools, but rural settlements in general. Here you see quotes from János Kolta, there is a cartoon on him, who was a chief planner of the urban network in Baranya County. That was the one creating official plans on small rural settlements. His point was simple: small settlements almost profoundly preclude that even a nearly equitable social, cultural, and administrative network is established and sustained. In that period, in official documents, the statement was that below 3,000 inhabitants, all settlements are economical and should be dissolved in the long run. We are speaking about half of all the settlements in then Hungary and 10% of the population. What was the new goal? Reconstruction of the settlement network. Nice word, reconstruction. And dissolution of settlement density. I know this term is quite awkward in English, but the original Hungarian version is similarly awkward. I somehow try to, make you feel how stupid this wording was. But of course, you know what it is about. And one interesting thing about the method, how it should be carried out, we shall guarantee in the entire process that it will be profoundly voluntary. Administrative or political measures must not be taken, but that the population of small villages gets concentrated in larger ones should be accelerated by influencing people in a planned way. if you want to see what influencing people in a planned way means, I can refer to a 1949 government decree that actually banned any sort of construction works in in scattered farms. Well, an efficient way of motivating people, right? However, it would be unjust to say that this tendency or this way of thinking was totally new. Actually, as early as in the interwar period, there was an ongoing debate about what to do with rural settlements in the long run. There was also an academic debate between these two guys, I will speak about them, who had a different view on the topic. Ferenc Erdei, who was a sociologist, and he was a leftist politician in the interwar period. His point was that scattered farms, you saw those two pictures, and the central towns are functioning so properly in unity with each other that it is a well-functioning system that should be promoted in urban planning in Hungary. Tibor Mendel, who was an urban geographer, he was politically not active, but he was still part of the national conservative academic elite in this period. He had a different view. He thought that rather scattered farm centers should be established and promoted because it is easier to provide simple public infrastructure for a village than for a scattered farm 50 to 100 times smaller. Still, you cannot say that Mendel actually wanted what then the communists did, because Mendel also added that where people are not willing to move to these centers, they shouldn't be made to do so. Of course, this part was absolutely neglected later on. Quite funnily, after the communist takeover, Erdei became Minister for Agriculture and also head of the Scattered Farm Council that was responsible for a so-called scientific solution of the scattered farm problem. And in this capacity, he had to, and he actually did, justify all those Stalinist concepts, which were diametrically opposed to his views in the interwar period. But, well, maybe he was an opportunist and so on. However, for the lack of time and lack of resources, these grandiose concepts were not really put in practice. So no actual progress was made in that period. And then the Hungarian Revolution took place in 1956. The communist system collapsed for a while, and then it was re-established, but in a new non-Stalinist form. From the early 1960s onwards, it is usually referred to as soft dictatorship. Well, that is quite an interesting term again. And after 1968, limited economic reforms were also introduced, ending up in the so-called goulash communism and a relatively higher standard of living compared to other communist countries. And even in planning, for example, Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy was decreasing and technocracy was clearly increasing. For example, in 1961, a new education law was introduced, which provided new curricula to scattered farm schools, meaning that by this it explicitly accepted the existence of scattered farm schools. In spatial planning, the new aim was proportional development, namely less resources for Budapest and the capital city and huge industrial centers, and more to agricultural regions. And in 1970, even the political framework, the public administration framework was changed, and centralization also decreased to some extent. However, you still cannot think that now it would be a good period for rural schools. This is the limited political decentralization. As you can see, some competencies were somehow allocated from the state level to the county level. For example, from now on, counties, so basically regions, got the money on housing projects, and they can decide on their own how to allocate this money inside the region. However, in planning, it was still a concept that there was a need for the liquidation of inherited disproportionalities of the settlement network. And in 1971, a national concept of settlement network development was issued, which actually also imported much from the Kristallarian concept of central places and so on. And somehow it indicated that there are many settlements which shouldn't have any functions in the future. And this resulted in the 1970s in the so-called process of rationalization, again a Fliebjergian term, but it was the actual word used by those planners in that period, that now we rationalize the settlement system. And you see the outcomes. Rural settlements received even less financing, and many villages lost their their basic infrastructure. you see here that in 1960 and in 1980 the number of settlements was almost the same. But one half of them lost their own councils, two-thirds of them lost their farmers' cooperatives and state farms, and you can see it here that almost 1,000 of them totally lost their elementary schools. In 10 years, basically, you see it here, that you know, the number of primary schools was basically constant over the 1950s and the 1960s, early 1960s as well, and then it declined by 1/3 in roughly 10 years. So I think it was a more harsh and rapid process than in Baden-Württemberg, for example, or in other Western contexts. Of course, the question comes up, thank you, how it was possible, after all these limited decentralization and so on, to carry out these projects. We have to consider three important things. One is that public property was not challenged, so infrastructure kept managed by the state. Second, this political decentralization only meant that some competencies were allocated from the state level to the regional one, but not to the local one. Meaning that actually localities now were not only reliant on the state, but also subordinated to the regions as well. And quite interestingly, regional leaderships were basically motivated in sucking out the resources from their own periphery in order to promote faster development in their own centers. And basically, since most of these local councils were closed in small settlements, they could really didn't do anything against it. And the party kept its political monopoly. That is something we shall not forget about, because cadres at all levels were still appointed by the state party leadership, or by regional organs maybe, but in a top-down process, they were responsible for their superiors and not to local inhabitants. So they didn't really try to hinder this process. I would underscore, however, that of course this process was not an essentially communist one, in the sense that closing rural schools was an ongoing project in many other contexts. In my view, the difference was rather that the political framework was different. So this concept could be carried out with much less obstacle for implementation. So as conclusion, for interwar Hungary, education was considered as means of making Hungary an influential country again, or who knows, I mean, well, it was a bit blurred, in international politics and economy, and rural schools were definitely regarded as a major prerequisite for establishing this cultural advantage. In the Stalinist period, there were conflicts between an egalitarian propaganda and interests in centralization, which then finally resulted in the concept that, well, equal access can be provided if many people living in small settlements are somehow relocated to bigger centers, and then we don't have any problem anymore. Of course, people were not asked about it, but in a Stalinist system, you don't have such problems. Ironically, so I'm speaking ironically, of course. And after 1957, although there was much less ideological opposition to rural schools, but there were ongoing attempts to rationalize the entire settlement network, which resulted finally in a radical decline of small rural settlements and rural schools as well, obviously. But really, although there are remarkable ruptures, I think it was possible to show to some extent that there were some continuities as well. For example, with regard to these debates about what to do with small settlements and so on. And I think this is, again, a sort of conclusion that in the communist period, concepts were used that were not unique or were not essentially communist. They were simply modernist concepts, but it was rather the different political framework that resulted in different outcomes, or maybe in a different pace of reaching these or achieving these outcomes than in other parts of the globe. So, thank you for attention.